Have you ever actually heard of a fighting style called Glima? I mean, really heard of it, not just seen the word somewhere next to Vikings and ancient combat. I hadn't, at least not properly. I'd seen the name pop up from time to time, usually framed as the wrestling art of the Vikings, and I just sort of accepted it without thinking much about it. But the first time I actually watched how Glima looks in practice, my reaction wasn't excitement, it was confusion. Because what I saw didn't match the image that had been built around it at all. When people talk about Vikings, they usually lean hard into brutality. Raids, weapons, violence, chaos. So when you hear that Glima is supposedly their fighting art, you expect something rough, aggressive, maybe even ugly. Instead, what you see is two people standing very upright, constantly adjusting balance, working for clean throws, trying not to fall themselves. There's no wild rush forward, no attempt to overwhelm the other person with force. It looks controlled, careful, almost restrained. And I always found it strange why something like this gets presented as a direct reflection of battlefield combat. My first thought was simple. If this was meant for war, it's a very odd design choice. The posture is tall, the movements are tight, and there's a lot of emphasis on staying on your feet. From my experience, that usually tells you something important about intent. Systems meant for killing tend to accept chaos and damage as part of the process. Systems meant for testing skill tend to avoid them. Glima clearly belongs to the second category, but for some reason it keeps being talked about as if it were the first. So I decided to look it up, not with the usual question of, would this work in a real fight, but with something more basic. Why did this exist in the first place? Because fighting systems don't just appear because people like violence, they appear because there's a social need for them. And once you ask that question, the whole image of Glima starts to shift. What becomes clear very quickly is that Glima, at least in the forms we can reasonably trace, wasn't some secret warrior art. It was practiced openly, often as a competition. There were rules, boundaries, and expectations. People watched it. People participated without expecting to leave injured. That alone already tells you a lot. Small communities don't normalize activities that regularly cripple their members, especially not in harsh environments where every able body matters. From my experience with grappling-based systems, when balance and posture are prioritized this much, it usually means one thing: control matters more than damage. You're not trying to break someone. You're trying to unbalance them, throw them, and stay standing yourself. The upright stance, the constant footwork, the focus on timing instead of raw power. All of that makes sense if the goal is to win without unnecessary harm. Glima fits that logic almost too well. Another thing that kept bothering me was how casually the word ancient gets thrown around in discussions about Glima. Ancient as in what, exactly? Ancient as in unchanged for 1,000 years, or ancient as in rooted in older traditions that evolved over time? Those are very different things, but they often get blended together to make the story sound more impressive. And that blending is where a lot of confusion starts. The more I looked at Glima, the more it felt like something deeply tied to everyday life, rather than warfare. A way to settle disputes, a way to compete, a way to prove physical ability without turning every confrontation into a bloodbath. That doesn't make it less interesting. If anything, it makes it more honest. But to understand that properly, you have to stop looking at Glima through the fantasy image of Vikings as constant fighters and start looking at the actual context they lived in, because that context explains far more than the myths ever will. To understand why Glima looks the way it does, you have to place it back into the environment where it actually made sense. Not the imagined world of constant raids and battles, but the much more ordinary reality of small Scandinavian communities. Most people didn't spend their lives fighting wars. They spent them working, surviving harsh seasons, and living very close to the same group of people year after year. That kind of life creates a very specific relationship with violence. Conflict in those societies wasn't rare. In fact, it was probably unavoidable. When resources are limited, tensions rise quickly. But open, lethal violence between members of the same community is expensive. It weakens everyone. So instead of removing conflict entirely, cultures often shape it. They create ways for people to test strength, courage, and status without crossing a point of no return. From that angle, Glima stops looking like a primitive combat system and starts looking like a solution. I always found it strange how often people assume that if something is physical, it must be about fighting enemies. In reality, a lot of physical traditions are about dealing with people you know very well. Neighbors, rivals, relatives. Glima fits that pattern. It's intense, but it's contained. You can win, you can lose, and afterward, life goes on. That matters a lot in places where you can't just walk away from your social circle. There's also the question of space and conditions. These weren't wide, open arenas or clean training halls. People wore heavy clothing. The ground wasn't forgiving. Falling badly could mean injury, even without anyone trying to hurt you. That alone explains why Glima emphasizes staying upright and maintaining balance. From my experience, systems that grow in those conditions tend to value stability over explosiveness. You don't take unnecessary risks because the environment punishes mistakes. What's important here is that Glima wasn't isolated from daily life. It wasn't something you trained in secret and only used in extreme situations. It existed alongside work, festivals, and social gatherings. People watched it. People understood it. That visibility changes everything. When an activity is public, it has to be controlled. It has to make sense to everyone involved. You can't hide behind mystery or danger. Another thing worth noting is how Glima handles winning and losing. The goal isn't humiliation, it's clarity. Someone is thrown, balance is broken, the exchange ends. That clear resolution is important in societies where unresolved tension can linger and cause real problems later. A clean outcome prevents grudges from turning into feuds. From that perspective, Glima almost feels like a pressure valve, a way to let aggression exist without letting it spiral. And that's not accidental. Humans have always needed physical outlets. When those outlets are removed entirely, violence tends to resurface in worse ways. Glima allowed strength and competitiveness to be expressed within boundaries everyone understood. This is where a lot of modern interpretations go wrong. They judge Glima as if it were incomplete, because it doesn't escalate. But escalation was never the goal. The goal was to settle something and move on. Once you see that, the entire system starts to look far more intentional than people give it credit for. And once the social role becomes clear, the next step is obvious. If Glima wasn't about chaos or destruction, then its technical choices weren't accidental either. They were shaped by very specific needs, and that's exactly what becomes visible when you start breaking down how the body is actually used in Glima. Once you stop looking at Glima as an incomplete fight and start looking at it as a system shaped by very specific conditions, its technical choices stop looking strange. They start looking consistent, almost strict. There isn't much excess in Glima, because excess simply wouldn't survive in the environment where it existed. Everything that remains serves one core idea: keep control of your own body while slowly taking that control away from the other person. The first thing most people notice is the posture. It's upright, almost rigid at first glance, with constant movement in the feet. If you're used to modern wrestling styles, this can feel wrong. The center of gravity looks too high. It feels like one mistake would send you flying. But that impression doesn't last long once you actually watch how balance is managed. In Glima, stability doesn't come from being low. It comes from never being static. You're not planting yourself. You're adjusting all the time. From my experience, systems built around this kind of balance demand much more awareness than raw strength. Small details matter: foot placement, the angle of the hips, the direction of pressure through the torso. You can't just lean in and push. The moment you overcommit, you give something away. Glima punishes force used without precision, and that's intentional. It teaches restraint through structure, not through rules alone. The way grips are used reinforces this idea. There's nothing flashy about them. No complex hand fighting, no constant switching. Most grips are simple and predictable, often involving the belt or the torso. But that simplicity is deceptive. You're not controlling a limb, you're controlling alignment. Once you influence the axis of the body, everything else follows. Strength becomes secondary very quickly. Clothing plays a role here, even if it's not always stated outright. Heavy garments, layered fabric, belts, all of that changes how contact feels. You're not dealing with bare skin or slippery surfaces. The connection is solid. Because of that, movements become economical. Sudden, aggressive actions stand out immediately. They're easy to read and easy to counter. Patience, on the other hand, blends in. It doesn't announce itself. Throws in Glima often look understated. There's no dramatic setup, no visible explosion. One moment both people are balanced, the next one of them isn't. That's it. From the outside, it can look almost anticlimactic. But that's exactly the point. Success doesn't come from overpowering the other person. It comes from recognizing the exact moment when balance is already compromised and doing just enough to finish the exchange. It's also important to notice what Glima deliberately avoids. There's almost no extended ground fighting, no attempt to continue once someone has fallen. From a modern combat perspective, that feels incomplete. But within its original context, it makes perfect sense. Once the throw happens, the situation is resolved. Escalation would only create new problems. The system is designed to end things cleanly, not to push them further. This changes the mindset of the practitioner. You're not thinking several moves ahead in a long sequence. You're fully focused on the present exchange. One moment of imbalance decides everything. That creates a very direct, almost honest form of physical interaction. There's no room to hide behind aggression or endurance. Either you manage balance or you don't. When you look at Glima this way, it becomes clear that it was never meant to be universal. It doesn't try to solve every possible scenario. It solves one specific problem very efficiently, and it's right here at this point where modern interpretations start to drift. Because once the original context fades, the techniques remain, and people begin to project new meanings onto them. To understand where tradition ends and reconstruction begins, you have to look at what happened to Glima after that context disappeared. At some point, Glima stopped being something people needed and became something people wanted to preserve. That shift didn't happen overnight, and it wasn't planned. It happened because the world around the practice changed. The social environment that once gave Glima its purpose slowly disappeared, but the movements remained. And when a tradition loses its original function, it doesn't vanish immediately. It adapts. This is where things start to get complicated. Modern Glima is often presented as a direct continuation of ancient practice, and in a very loose sense, that's true. The core ideas are still there: balance, control, clean execution. But continuity doesn't mean sameness. Rules change, emphasis shifts, training methods evolve. That doesn't make modern Glima fake, but it does mean we should be careful with how much we project backwards. From my experience, reconstruction always fills gaps. When historical sources are limited, people rely on interpretation. They look at what survived and try to imagine what must have existed before. Sometimes those interpretations are reasonable. Sometimes they reflect modern expectations more than historical reality. And Glima is no exception to this. There's also a strong cultural element at play. As societies change, they often look back in search of identity. Traditions become symbols. Glima, in that sense, becomes more than a physical practice. It becomes a link to the past. That link is important, but it also creates pressure. Once something is framed as heritage, it's tempting to freeze it in time or present it as untouched by history. Reality is rarely that clean. I've always found it strange how confidently people talk about how Vikings fought based on practices that were clearly shaped by later needs. Competitive formats, standardized rules, public demonstrations. These things tell us more about the period when Glima was being preserved than about the period when it first emerged. Again, that's not a criticism. It's just how traditions survive. What often gets lost in this process is context. Techniques are kept, but the reasons behind them fade. Without that context, it's easy to reinterpret movements as something more dramatic or more violent than they ever were. A clean throw becomes a battle technique. A balance drill becomes combat training. The language changes, even if the movement doesn't. This is also where modern audiences come in. People today want clarity. They want labels. Is this a sport? Is it a martial art? Is it combat effective? Glima doesn't fit neatly into those categories, so it gets reshaped to match them. The result is often a version of Glima that looks impressive, sounds ancient, and feels satisfying, even if it no longer reflects its original role. What's important to understand is that this process isn't unique to Glima. It happens to many traditional practices once they outlive the conditions that created them. Preservation becomes performance, function becomes form. And while something is inevitably lost in that transition, something else is gained as well. The tradition survives, even if it changes its purpose, recognizing that shift doesn't diminish Glima. If anything, It makes it easier to appreciate it for what it actually is today, rather than what we want it to represent. And that brings us to the final question worth asking. If Glima isn't a window into Viking warfare, then what does it really show us about the people who practiced it, and about how we think about martial traditions in general? When you put everything together, Glima starts to say something very different from what most people expect when they hear about Viking combat. It doesn't tell us how people killed each other. It tells us how they lived with each other, and that difference matters more than any discussion about effectiveness or realism. I think the reason Glima confuses modern audiences so much is because we're used to looking at martial traditions through a very narrow lens. We want them to answer extreme questions. What happens in a real fight? How much damage can it cause? Would it work today? Glima quietly refuses to play that game, and because of that, it often gets dismissed or misunderstood. From my experience, traditions like this are uncomfortable for us precisely because they don't fit into clean categories. Glima isn't purely sport, but it's not unrestricted combat either. It sits in that middle space where physical skill, social rules, and mutual understanding intersect. That space doesn't get much attention today, even though historically it was incredibly important. What Glima really shows is that not all martial practices were built around domination. Some were built around limitation, around knowing where to stop, around resolving tension without creating new problems. In a world where people couldn't afford endless cycles of violence, that kind of restraint wasn't a moral choice. It was a practical one. I've always found it interesting how modern culture tends to equate violence with authenticity. The more brutal something looks, the more real it feels. Glima pushes back against that idea. It suggests that control, balance, and clarity can be just as real, and sometimes far more meaningful. That's not a comforting message, but it's an honest one. Seen this way, Glima isn't a failed combat system or a watered-down art. It's a record of priorities. It shows what a society valued enough to formalize, teach, and preserve. Strength, yes, but strength with limits. Competition, but competition that ends cleanly. Skill, but skill that serves the group, not just the individual. In the end, I don't think the most interesting question about Glima is whether it would work in a modern fight. That question misses the point. The more interesting question is what it reveals about how people once managed conflict, identity, and physicality without letting those things tear their communities apart. And once you start looking at it from that angle, Glima stops needing justification. It stands on its own. Maybe that's why it survived at all. Not because it was the most dangerous way to fight, but because it was a sustainable way to compete. And in a long historical view, that kind of sustainability tells us far more about human behavior than any story about violence ever could.